Jesse, God's freedom is one of the attributes of God that I find most fascinating. Not often talked about, but it's really a probe of what this being who is supposed to be the creator of the universe really is. So I like to ask questions about this God's freedom. And here's one for you. Supposedly, if you believe in God and the Bible, there were angels before human beings, and God created these angels, and a third of them decided that they were going to rebel against God. Now, I can give you a lot of reasons why that sounds ridiculous. These angels are powerful, they see God, they know God, and still they think they can get away with this. Could God have created angels that didn't revolt?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating thought experiment. And I think you're right, too, that angels don't always get attention, but if you do give them attention, it does raise different sorts of questions than you get if you're just talking about humans. Because as you say, you have these beings who are supposed to really know what they're doing, far more than we are. So why would they fall if there were such beings? I think on the freedom of choice answer, there's the suggestion that God needs to allow them some possibilities for mistakes so that they can be creators of their own identities, morally and spiritual speaking. So maybe, in fact, God would even have to limit them in certain ways or not give them full information so that then they would be able to make their own decisions for themselves. If they knew how things were going to turn out or what the full implications of their choices would be, then actually it would be harder for them to have choices.
God had to trick them.
So in that sense, perhaps, yeah, for them to have libertarian free will, God had to play this little game with them, but it was for their own good, right?
Yeah, but they revolted, some.
Right, and so then the question is, does he then hope to bring them back, or is that just it? They've made their choice, he gave them that option, and there it is. Mm-hmm. And of course, for many traditional theologians, that's sort of it. They get actually just one choice for many of these theologians, and that's the sort of end of the story.
One choice, one time.
Right? Yeah. But the other possibility, and again, the one that I think is maybe more interesting, is the possibility that if God is in control of the storyline as it's playing out, that it might be the case that God actually wants some of these beings not to simply be perfect throughout the whole story, because that gives a different kind of quality to the narrative. Perhaps, for instance...
It makes a more interesting world. I mean, it may not be a better world or a happier world or a more benevolent world, but certainly more interesting.
You get different varieties of things. Right. That's right. And Augustine likes to talk about how there are different qualities that God likes to display, almost as if God were an artist and he wanted to show off the palette or something like that. I don't know how far that gets you all the time, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And he has this conception that God shouldn't just create stuff that's good, but it has to be good in the full-fledged sense that it should be beautiful. And so there's then this idea that he's trying to tell this really beautiful, engaging, dynamic story, and you should have rise and fall of all sorts of beings, including the angels. And so perhaps then God is actually trying to have the angels play a certain kind of role in this narrative, where they are both an example for humanity, for good and for evil, but also a kind of a driving power in the story. Or after all, in the traditional Garden of Eden story, it's not just Adam and Eve, there's an angel there, and he's decided that he wants to trick them so that they can sort of be on his side.
Under this way of thinking, God's freedom, in a sense, is protected because God is making this very complex structure. So with a full freedom to do that, not constrained by having to be perfectly good. And therefore, the angels had to be created all good because some were bad. So that immediately presents a problem. Is God not all powerful? Not all knowing, or deliberately did it? But it certainly seems to protect the freedom.
Yeah, I think that the classical authors would also want to say that it protects God's goodness, but in just a kind of a rich sense where God is up to something that's very, very dense in meaning and texture, and we may not fully understand all of the ways in which it's good until you get to the end of the story, and of course they don't think we're at the end of the story. So it may turn out, if you have a kind of an optimistic view, that somehow all of these angels get brought back in, because if God's the one telling the story, maybe in the end there's some kind of return to home, right? Where they all get brought back in.
Yeah, the problem at that point would be then the story doesn't become interesting anymore, and we go on forever in a very boring state. I won't burden you with that one. But what I do want to ask you is, if predestination is true, what does that say about God's freedom?
I think it suggests that God's freedom is complete in the sense that he has oversight of all things. So in that sense, it is maybe the strongest conception of freedom that one could have for God, because God has complete leeway about what God is up to. God is the master storyteller, and we are secondary agents. So we have agency, but God is the one who writes the overall structure of the narrative. And in that sense, nothing will stand in the way of God. On other weaker conceptions, God sort of has to junk and weave through the various powers that he's put in the world, but he has to kind of let them do their thing for at least a while and then respond to it. And in that sense, it may not seem to be quite as radical or strong a conception of God's freedom. The other thing I would say about predestination as it relates to God's freedom is that it suggests that God may have intentionality about how to relate his freedom to human or angelic freedom, so that there might be certain things he wants to give or impart to the rest of the storyline, so to speak. For instance, one traditional affirmation is that God is trying to make the story be like the divine properties, or to display the divine properties in certain ways. So bestowing a kind of power and ability, but also similar kinds of goodness to the ones that God has. And that seems like, on a predestinarian view, God can definitely make all that happen. Whereas on the weaker views, where it's just up to us whether we follow God, God can maybe try to do it, but you can't be sure if it'll work out that way. The world isn't necessarily going to imitate all these things in God that God might want to imitate.
So the strong position of God, in a sense, gives God more freedom to do what God wants.
Yeah, and maybe to tell a better story in that sense.